Hello and welcome to episode 14 of a Plain Accounts web series where we look at least one of this coming Sunday's lectionary passages. And today we have with us, as always, Ben Kramer. Would you like to say hello, Ben?
Hey, Ben Kramer, lead pastor of Boise Euclid Church of the Nazarene in Idaho.
And commentator Hannah Beers. Hannah, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hannah Beers. I'm the Director of Recruitment at Nazarene Theological Seminary here in Kansas City. I'm a Northwest Nazarene grad, and I'm also a grad of NTS as of 2014.
Wonderful. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for your excellent commentary on Joshua. Really appreciated your words there. And speaking of which, let's jump right into this conversation. Today we're going to discuss both Joshua and Luke. The Old Testament and the Gospel lections for this week. We're going to spend time looking at both, so we need to kind of move. There's a lot to talk about in these passages. So I'm going to go ahead and read Joshua 5, 9 through 12, this shorter passage. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt," and so that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the Israelites were encamped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. Written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so Hannah, you wrote the commentary. Tell us everything we need to know about this passage.
Everything you need to know about Joshua. The Lord provides, that's what it is. But that's a basic one. To start out with, though, I think some of the important things to realize is the significance of the very first verse that's included in what Danny just read, was the fact of, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt," and so that this place is called Gilgal to this day. I don't know. I think that's a key verse. Like, why would that be included? There's just a key significance about what God is doing and trying to do in the lives of the Israelites at this point in time as well. I think one of the other significance that we see right here is when it says, "rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So thinking about in the historical context, if we look at this, we've got the Israelites having left Egypt, thinking that, yes, we're going to the promised land, point A, point B, we're going to get there quickly. Instead, they start a journey that lasts 40 years. And so they're wandering through the wilderness for 40 years. I have to wonder what the Egyptians were also saying at that point in time. Like, they would have been in a similar territory. They wouldn't have necessarily been further away. Other nations would have been looking on them and thinking, what are you guys doing? You said you were being delivered from the hands of the Egyptians, and now all you're doing is wandering. Where's this God that you speak of? And so at this point, why this is significant here is at this time, God is telling Joshua and the Israelites that he is fulfilling what he had promised when they had left the Egyptians. And the shame that they may have felt or been projected onto them, he was now taking upon himself as the fulfillment of the promise to the Israelites. It's a key passage right there as we look to see what God was doing through the provision in the wilderness, and then also what he was doing by way of the promised land.
Interesting. Now, you wrote in your commentary about the circumcision.
Yes.
That's not in these verses so much, but it's important, right?
Yes, it is, because when it says in verse 10 that they kept the Passover, when they would have been in the wilderness in this, they would have still kept with tradition, but it wouldn't have been the fulfillment that we see right here. And why it was significant for some of the people that I read and some of the commentators that I looked at in association with this, the circumcision was by way of a reference back to Exodus 12. And it was reference back to what had been given to Moses and what the Israelites were supposed to do as a nation to participate as God's chosen people in this. And so the circumcision actually was something by way of preparing all the men to be able to participate in this Passover, which was in effect honoring what had been fulfilled as they had left Egypt. And so no, it wasn't mentioned in these verses. Is it important? Yes. It's the Israelites' participation in what God has asked them to do and also what God fulfilled.
Interesting. And can you speak to the significance of them eating the produce of the land? Like, why is this a big deal?
Couple of reasons why the eating of the grain, eating of the fruits of the land, is it doesn't look very glorious in those couple of verses. Because if you think about the promised land and you think about what God's saying He's going to provide to them, you think of like more of like a banquet feast. But rather, when we look at this, it's unleavened cakes and parched grain, seemingly very common items there.
Good.
But at the same time, it's truly coming from the earth, and what it is it's that investment of this has gone forward, this has been prepared. It may not be glorious, but I don't think all of God's unveiling is always very glorious right away. What it is that's the fulfillment and the participation. But what's key is the fact that manna ceased on that day, that they ate from the land as well. And so it wasn't so much as a glorious feast before them, but God had provided by way of manna the entire time. But when they finally ate from the ground that had been promised to them, manna ceased altogether and is not mentioned again at this point in time.
So they're no longer depending on Yahweh, right?
Not necessarily, not just depending on Yahweh, but God has fulfilled a way in this point of saying, I have promised the produce of the land that has been promised to you and to your forefathers. It's a different type of a vision. At this point in time, they are on this cusp. They've crossed over the water. They're sitting here. They're coming back to a point that they have already been, which is the significance of Gilgal's relation to Jericho. And at this point in time, historically, it's just significant for them to be back at this specific location. And at this point, it's not so much that God's not providing, but it's their participation actively in the promise that was provided to them.
So I shouldn't interpret this as I rely on myself. I'm an independent person. I pull myself up by my bootstraps.
Not so much.
Oh.
I mean, I personally wouldn't interpret that way, but if you want to, more power to you, I guess.
No, I'm speaking tongue in cheek. I think we're inclined to want to do that through our Western lens.
Oh, very much so. I think when it comes to that point, like where it's here, is like, of course we've got to do this all by ourselves. But if we see throughout the biblical narrative, there's this ebb and flow between God's promise and people's participation in it. And God's inviting that. He's not just saying, I'm going to provide everything, but I want you to be a part and come with me. Even though I'm providing, there's still there's a participation, there's a relationship that's going on there. So it's not just us doing it all on our own independence, but it's them being able to participate as this community now there.
So it's an invitation to participate, this relationship.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So how do we preach it? How do you preach Joshua? How do you preach these 4 verses?
How do you preach these 4 verses? It's an invitation to a relationship of God's promise. God can do all of this minus our participation in it. But what's important here is that even though it's not in our timing, it does not mean that God will not fulfill it. And so it's more about this, I think, during this exiled period for them to be wandering in the wilderness, it was maybe a way of seeing God through a new lens for them. Because when they were leaving Egypt, I imagine that there's a sense of we're going to go from point A to point B quickly. But the process and the formation by way of which we walk with God during times where we feel like God is void from, like, we go through a difficult time, we may not hear God, we may not see how God is actively working in our congregations, and yet it does not mean that God is void of that. What it means is God is working in a way in which to prepare for us this expedited journey and a fulfillment of that promise. I think as we preach it, the important part is God's provision in here, but also that invitation of participation. So.
Yeah, it's God who has been doing the providing for so long, and God is still doing the providing in the grain, in the produce.
Yeah.
I mean, if we want to do if we want to read into the New Testament a little bit of Jesus, only God can make things grow, right?
Yeah.
So God is still the agent of action, but the agent has invited us.
Think about it. At this point in time, the Canaanites would have been participating in this, but who's to say, like, their agricultural bent was, like, the way of God's provision even here, and how this was produced to be able to feed all of the Israelites as they walked over and as manna ceased and as they were eating from the ground. There was a certain sense of God is truly the one who grows and flourishes, and that I don't know, just that agricultural bent to this too is so significant and is seen through different parables even.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, that's huge. And we'll come back to this, and we can kind of connect this a little bit to Luke 15, because there are some parallels. But one thing that I've noticed as well is the importance of this placement in the season. This text it's an important text to read on the fourth Sunday in Lent. As we are moving, as we're progressing through this Lenten season, our own little exile, our own wilderness periods, we want to just jump from one thing to the next, but this allows us to kind of gradually transition out of Lent into Easter. We see the responsibility of the Israelites in being circumcised and preparing the Passover meal as they are entering out of wilderness into the Promised Land. It allows us to kind of transition out of Lent a little bit. We see what's coming. We're going into that promise.
Well, I think it's also that a good word is that divestment of self. Like, we throw those terms around a lot, but it's truly during not only the Lenten season, but as we see right here, what the Israelites were participating in. I mentioned circumcision in my commentary, but just with the circumcision of the men, there would have been other things that the Israelites would have participated in preparation for. And part of that, and much of what we do, even in the Lenten season, is how do we divest of self to be able to participate with God in that. And so it's that continual participation in a relationship to where at times we must become lesser so that God can become more apparent as we celebrate and as we look to Easter. We know what that promise is now, but at these points in time, I think as the Israelites were walking through that exile period and even further being divested in those years that they were in exile, they didn't necessarily know all of what was promised in the full fulfillment of it because they didn't see it at that point in time. We get that opportunity in this Lenten season, so we take heart in knowing that God is faithful in this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's transition to Luke 15. This is the story of the prodigal, what is called the prodigal son. Let's go ahead and read. I'll read this very quickly. It's a longer passage, so I'm going to kind of speed read through this, and we're fairly familiar with it. But Luke 15, 1 through 3, 11 through 32. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father, but while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and we won't be able to touch everything in the time allotted, but let's try to hit some of the high points, and then an important question is, how do we preach this? And so Ben, can you speak a little bit about what kind of your research and how you've been thinking about this passage this week, and then I'll share a little bit and we can talk.
I think connection to the other parables about the lost coin and the lost sheep, we're supposed to be thinking of lack, loss, and plenty, and what we do in those differing circumstances. The word prodigal means lavish, so we're supposed to be thinking of when we read that parable, the lavishness of the father, the lavishness that the son squanders, the younger son squanders, and the lavishness that the oldest son does not really understand that he's had at his disposal the entire time. And from a position of privilege, like in North America, we can kind of downplay, well, they just lost coins or they just lost a sheep. Like, so what? I mean, that's nothing big. Those are pretty replaceable in a position of privilege. But trying to understand how traumatic that can be in first century context. Losing dowry coins would be equivalent to losing insurance completely. Losing a sheep would be equivalent to losing your livelihood, the ability to provide for yourself and your family, and how easily the younger son squanders that sort of lavishness that he has from the father, and how the oldest son just kind of denies that he's had that the entire time with the father. So my mind runs back and forth between the traumatic nature of loss and how that equates to sinners bringing about their sin in context with community, and how we sort of keep them at arm's length when that happens. We don't really celebrate when they return, and we don't go seeking out after them either, like these people do in these parables of loss and being found. And then the role of the father in the midst of it. I think there's some really important parallels to make between the role of the gardener we saw in last week's pericope, cultivating the soil, fertilizing, giving the tree all the resources possible to prosper, lavishly laying upon it, and the father in this parable as well, running out to you. It's important to understand that getting down in the dirt was a shameful thing. You don't get your hands dirty, and yet we see that image of the gardener in last week's pericope. Running as a landowning male would be shameful, and we see that in the father. Giving the inheritance before he's dead was shameful, and we just constantly seeing God taking the role of a servant from the beginning for us, and how much that lavishness that we just kind of overlook at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of the one thing that David Luce wrote that was really good is that this is a story to be kind of heard and experienced, not analyzed. But I think it's important for us to hear the story. We have to kind of know that context, right? So giving some, we have to exegete the text well in order to hear the story appropriately. And I think one of the things we notice is that even in the first few verses, the Pharisees say, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." Now, eating with sinners was a problem, but Pharisees would have done it begrudgingly, and we see that practiced in Acts 10 with Peter, who says to the Gentile, "I'm not even supposed to be with you, but I'm here." He gives that distance. Jesus doesn't give that necessary distance between a Jew and a sinner, a righteous and an unrighteous. He welcomes them. That's their problem. It's not that he says, "I'm not supposed to be with you guys, but I am." It's he's happy to be with them. And then Jesus tells them this parable, which is in the singular, that's interesting because we think of chapter 15 as 3 separate parables, but Jesus is telling them one incredibly long parable. So if you want to read the story of the lost sons, maybe that's a better title. you have to read about the lost sheep and the lost coin in order to understand the lost sons. This is all one parable. And then something else that jumped out really as I was reading this just now is that the younger son asks for his share, and the father divided his property between the two sons. So the father has given up his property completely to both of the sons, not just to the younger, but even the older received the greater share. So both sons are receiving their property before the father's death, which culturally is just, it wouldn't happen. You talked about the shame of the father, Ben. This is shaming of the father right here from the very beginning. The younger son asks for his inheritance, and the father says, yeah, okay. That doesn't happen. That is shameful to the father and to the family, yet he does it. And he does it not just to the younger, but he even gives the property to the older son too. So both sons here are receiving their property, their inheritance, prior to the death of the father. And the son then going off, and he couldn't necessarily, it wasn't just a lump of money that he received from his father. He received land and animals. And so then he has sold off portions of the family land. He's sold off a portion of the livestock, and now, so he is in a sense saying, Father, you are dead to me. This thing that I'm not supposed to receive until you are dead, I want now. You mean nothing to me anymore. This family means nothing to me. You're dead, and I'm going and doing my own thing. This is an absolute shame on the father, and the father receives that shame. And something else that needs to be mentioned that's huge, I read this in Kenneth Bailey's book, Jacob and the Prodigal. Incredible book that I recommend to all who are preaching this passage ever in their life, which would be almost every pastor. But Bailey talks about this ceremony that's written about in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ceremony of kazaza, which is kind of just a fun word to say. But the kazaza was a ceremony whereby if a Jewish person had squandered or lost their inheritance to Gentiles, specifically to Gentiles, if they had squandered it and they wanted to come back home, the entire village would meet that son at the entrance to the village with an earthenware pot filled with roasted nuts and roasted corn, and would smash it on the ground in front of the son, and they would say, you are no longer a part of this community. You are banished from this community. You are shunned. And so the father knows this ceremony, and in anticipation of the son's return, the father evidently knows that the son is going to return. It says in verse 20, the son went off to see his father, but while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. While the son was still far off, the father left the house and ran to him, which again is a shaming activity for a first century landowner. So he sees this, he knows the ceremony is going to happen, this kazaza ceremony, if the son comes back and has squandered his property to Gentiles, which he has done. So he goes out and he meets him outside of the city gates, outside of the village, and reconciles publicly with his son. Therefore, the shame is no longer on the son, it's on the father. The kazaza ceremony is not going to happen anymore. And I know I'm jumping around, but there's a lot to talk about. The son, before he comes home, he says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. Our tendency, especially in this Lenten season, is to see that as repentance. But I think if we look in the context, it says when the son came to himself. Again, we think of that as, oh, the son is realizing the error of his way. But I think what we need to see that as is the son is, he's trying to return to himself. Well, he's trying to look out for number one. He's trying to do what's best for me. He says, how many of my father's hands have enough food and I'm dying of hunger? If I want to eat, I need to go there. He's looking out for himself. He came to himself. He did not come to the Father, which is what he should have done. So then he says, I've sinned against heaven and before you. These are the same words that Pharaoh uttered prior to the Israelites leaving Egypt. Pharaoh, in his hardened heart, says, I've sinned against heaven and against you. Is this confession? Or is this a ploy to pull on the heartstrings of somebody who might be compassionate? I think if we're to see this properly, it's not repentance this son has, not so properly understood. He's going so that he can have a meal, which, whatever. And the father doesn't care why he comes back. All he cares is that he's coming back. And so then he has this shame. And once again, I don't want to ignore the elder son because that's what we typically do. But the son refused to go into the banquet. And what does the father do? The father goes out to him. His father came out and began to plead with him. Again, a shaming activity. If the son refuses to come to the meal, well, then the shame is on the son for not joining the family. Yet the father goes out and is willing to be shamed in public for the sake of his other lost son, who is not in a far-off land geographically, but is in a far-off land relationally. So, I mean, that's a lot, and there's so much to cover in this. But so I guess one of the questions is, Ben, Hannah, how do we preach this? Knowing all that's going on, exegeting the text, exegeting our culture, how do you preach this passage this Sunday?
I've been really ruminating around how fearful our culture is. We live in such a culture of fear that it's not so much the honor-shame community that this was written in, but it's such a culture of fear that if anything is morally repugnant or reprehensible or anything suspicious, we kind of fearmonger and separate ourselves from them. And so much can be drawn from these parables about the nature of sin and how God responds with infectious holiness and compassion rather than fear. And I think that might be a big component to emphasize to our congregations, is that, like, even from Joshua to Luke, you see God going out of God's way to provide, going out of God's way to even risk shaming God's self to be with us, to bring us salvation, to save us. And how much we allow our fear of the other, fear of being tainted by the sin of the other, to prevent us from living into that compassion ourselves. So I think challenging our congregations to say, do you see how compassionate your Father is? Do you see how compassionate, connecting it with the fig tree at the gardener, last week, is the gardener gets down on his knees and cultivates the soil, fertilizes it, and this week we see the father shaming himself, running out, going out of his way, giving the inheritance before the due time. Do you see what the Father does for you? Do you see how much God lavishly cares for you? And then say, what are you going to do about that? What will you be the oldest son? Because we're left with a cliffhanger once again. Did the oldest son accept the lavishness of the Father? And I think we can end with that and say, what are you going to do? Are you going to accept this? Are you going to live that out? Are you going to participate like Joshua's text asks us to do? Will you participate in the lavishness of the Father?
Even though you're invited to it, maybe in somebody else's honor.
Right.
What if it's not about you?
Yeah.
I think another thing to echo kind of what both of you gentlemen have said is the celebration that was thrown for the one that had returned, even though maybe it wasn't the full act of repentance. But how often do some of our churches, so if we're thinking about preaching this to a congregation, we become still skeptical through the fear that we view others in, that even if one did come back, the celebration that the Father threw for that younger son is something that often through a very Western lens, we see something, oh, it's done, let's move on to the next thing. Rather, at this moment, everything halted at that time for the Father to be able to kill the fattened calf for the celebration of this one lost son having returned. And so for us, at times, I think in the church, we've lost our ability to celebrate with the one, out of whether it's fear of placing them in a category that we kind of want to say, oh, well, that's this person over here. We've kind of barricaded ourselves off with skepticism, or whether it's the fear that has held us within our own confines. But we've lost this ability to truly celebrate what it means for one lost person, one lost sheep to have been found, to be brought back in to the greater community, because at times it becomes much more about ourselves, which is where we see ourselves potentially in the older son at this time, the other lost son. And so if presenting this to the congregation, how do we celebrate with those that have returned, knowing that it's the Father that came out and welcomed them, but it's that celebration that was halted in the general flow. We don't halt, we don't celebrate even in the church as we should. We become very task-oriented rather than seeing the celebration of what this is significantly about. Yeah. And it's also, if I can be bold to say, it's not about 100 that came back here. It's not about the numbers that were here. It's truly about that one lost son, and that was enough to be able to essentially roll out the red carpet for this one. Yeah. So at times I think our skepticism is found more in that older brother, and at times I feel like we need to look at what the Father did in that celebration there. So it's not about the numbers, it's about the celebration of a one that has returned.
Yeah. And one thing I want to ask is, are we willing to be like the Father? Are we willing to get outside of the village limits and to welcome this person who has lived this lavish, squandering lifestyle with those Gentiles? Who are the Gentiles? Who are those people we better not be associated with? And would we publicly shame ourselves in our acceptance? Will we reach them with open arms? I like what Andy McGee wrote in the commentary this week about having that posture of open arms. Would we be willing to accept those people, even those who might be unrepentant? Who would we be willing to go and find them in a way that others might look at us and say, "What are you doing?" You realize how shameful that is? You realize how inappropriate that is? Would we be willing to receive that public shame in order to bring that one in?
I think honestly that we've thrown around the word shame. I think it's very difficult as a Western culture and in the mindset of the North American that I know all three of us have grown up in. Shame is not something that our culture sees in relation to as other cultures would embrace shame. So in a very very basic definition, it's not the cool thing to do to walk out in that sense and to open our arms to the ones that the majority of society would say, no, you've gone far enough. And so in that, it's the question to rephrase it is, are you willing to be uncool and walk out and still embrace those that are still welcomed in Christ's family? And so shame is difficult for our culture, I think, to understand because it's something we don't talk about very often even. Yeah. And so I think our gut reaction, Danny, would be say, of course we'd be the ones who would walk out there. We would be the ones to welcome them in. If we were honest with ourselves, it's a lot easier said than truly embodied from a day in and day out perspective. And it's not something that's a one and done. It's that continual of, are we welcoming the other into this community, not for the sake of saying that we've done it, but truly for who that person is and that celebration of the life that is lived there.
Absolutely.
Easier said than done.
As usual, right?
Always.
Ben, do you have any final words before we close this episode?
There's a burden on the preacher this week with so much to be said, so much to connect, and I resonate with what you said earlier, Danny, with about the story needs to be told and often invited into. We need to invite others into this story to take the role of the father, to understand where they might be the younger son or the older son, and to really understand that embodying compassion is our responsibility. It's not a spectator sport. So when we preach this text, to be really asking to invite and to invest in what we are about as God's people. The Father's children. Will we emulate the Father in how we act as children?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ben, great to chat with you. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure having you share, and thanks for contributing to A Plain Account this week. Preach well, preach boldly, preachers. These are important texts, and these are important chapters and verses for us to be preaching from. And even if Luke 15 is familiar, preach well, preach boldly, do your work. And join us again next week for our next episode, episode 15. Like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We have an Instagram now, which is cool, I think. That's what we're doing these days, right? But thanks again for watching. We hope this has been beneficial to you. And make sure you bookmark A Plain Account in your web browser and refer to it every week, because the essays are just phenomenal. We have people like Hannah Beers writing for us, which is awesome. So great to have you watching. And Ben, Hannah, thank you so much for this great conversation. I love it. I look forward to it every week.
As do I.
All right. Take care.